Nobody's ever seen a bacteria-like organism produce anything other than a bacteria-like organism. Nobody's ever seen a bacteria produce a non-bacteria or come from a non-bacteria. But these evolutionists, they want you to believe so desperately that bacteria, whales, T-Rex, and carrots are all related through common ancestry. Guys, this is Standing for Truth, and this is a short video exposing the absurdity of fish to fisherman, bacteria-like organism to biologist, evolution. If you haven't seen my last 2-on-1 Lion's Den debate, I highly recommend watching it, because during this debate, I brought up Lenski's bacterial experiment. And after generations and generations and generations of bacteria, what have we learned? We have learned that bacteria produce bacteria, and bacteria produce more degenerate bacteria. This is degeneration at its finest. Genes are being lost short term, but it's a long-term degeneration. But at the end of the day, evolutionists scoff and say things like, of course we expect bacteria to produce bacteria. The law of monophyly, we'd never outgrow our ancestry. And of course, creationists agree with the law of monophyly. God created original created kinds with front-loaded functional DNA differences, and based on processes such as recombination, gene conversion, mutations, and so on and so forth. We've seen new varieties and new species, adaptations to new environments. This is expected, and of course these original created kinds haven't grown outside of their ancestry, meaning bacteria and whales and pine trees are not related through common ancestry. We see Rayrard here in the comment section, who says, of course this is what we'd expect given evolutionary theory. And I ask here, okay, well, at one time, according to evolutionary history, was the earth ruled by bacteria-like organisms? And he says yes. Just let that sink in, yes. Well, according to their fairy tale, if the earth was ruled by bacteria-like organisms, and what we know is that bacteria produces bacteria with no exception. That means the earth should have always been ruled by bacteria-like organisms, but billions of years later, and according to them, incremental changes, slow changes, lots and lots of time. Time is their god, as I've said. But time is the killer for evolutionary theory. Time doesn't make things better. Time leads to extinction and degeneration. We're going downhill and not up. But billions of years later, what do we have? We have not only bacteria-like organisms and bacteria, and whales and pine trees and humans and monkeys and all this variety of life, biodiversity. That means there had to have been some significant, large-scale, meaningful and novel changes. New information must have arisen, because there's information in a whale that isn't present in a bacteria-like organism, and that's why it's a fairy tale. It's science fiction to say that a bacteria-like organism evolved slowly, indirectly, directly, incremental changes, lots of time, billions of years. It doesn't matter where they hide it. That's the thing. They hide their fairy tale in science, but it doesn't belong in science. And at the end of the day, it's not science to say that a bacteria-like organism evolved into a whale. Look carefully at this comment section here. Look carefully at how this evolutionist, Rayrard here, admits, yes, according to his fairy tale, the earth was ruled at one time by bacteria-like organisms. But according to the evolutionists, bacteria produce bacteria without exception. Let that sink in, guys.
But you're not saying it belongs to a different tree of life from me, are you?
Well, I think the tree of life is an artifact of some early scientific studies that aren't really holding up. So the tree, there may be a bush of life.
Right. Yes.
Bush.
I don't like that word.
But that's only in.
All right, I concede that point. Yeah.
So there is not a tree of life, and in fact, from our deep sequencing of organisms in the ocean, out of now we have about 60 million different unique gene sets. We found 12 that look like a very, very deep branching, perhaps fourth domain of life.
They found single-celled algae in the wild
In the
and
wild.
subjected them to selection pressures like predators, and they evolved multicellularity.
I'll have to investigate that. I'm going to say right now, I doubt that seriously. It might be a colony or cooperation, but it's not a two-celled organism. But to go from an amoeba or a single-celled organism to something like a whale or an elephant is going to require a whole lot more than just a cooperation of cells.
That never happens. No one thinks that happens.
It never happens. Great, you're a creationist. Great, you're a creationist.
Congratulations.
A bacteria can never produce a non-bacteria. It never happens. We didn't evolve from bacteria. We're not bacteria.
Evolution is a process of gradual and progressive change that has resulted in the development of more complex and diverse life on Earth. So in biology, when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about how over time life has gone from simple organisms to more complex and diverse, which means more types.
Okay, there are genetic limits, but there are quite a few limits. Would you agree that, let's see, bacteria produce more bacteria?
Yes.
Okay. Are there limits? Can we ever get a bacteria as big as a house, or are they limited?
That's a physical limit.
Okay. Can you ever get a bacteria as big as a whale?
No.
You believe something like a bacteria, a single-celled creature, turned into a whale.
They banded together to form colonies.
And turned into a whale.
Yeah.
Wow.
So the first half of the skeptic's typical question is, Noah's Ark can't possibly be true because you can't possibly fit the 1.6 million species that exist today on board the Ark. Of course, the answer to that is Noah didn't have to fit all the 1.6 million species on board the Ark. Number one, because he's not putting whales on the Ark. It's a flood after all. And number two, he's not going to fit likely not going to fit all the arthropods, spiders, insects, so forth. He's just bringing the land-dependent, air-breathing creatures on board the Ark, which is basically mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds. And the scripture doesn't even speak of species. Some English Bibles unfortunately use that term, but species is really a modern invention thanks to Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s.
Okay.
The Hebrew Bible speaks of kinds. That's typically the English word we use to translate the Hebrew word mean. So God creates creatures in Genesis chapter 1 according to their mean, and Noah's commanded to take creatures on board the ark according to their mean, their kinds. And if you look at what kinds are, Noah's commanded to take the male and female of each kind for the purpose of preserving their seed, their offspring. That implies then that if we can interbreed certain individuals, even if they're separate species, they're probably part of the same kind. And applying that criterion to the animal world, there's a general rule that has emerged. There are species that can still produce live offspring today. As a general rule, the kind is not a species. The kind is not even a genus. That's the next level up of classification. So, for example, the red fox and the Arctic fox not only are separate species, they each are placed in their own genus. That's not the level of kind either. Rather, the family level. So using the fox example, foxes, coyotes, wolves, dogs, dingoes all belong to the same family. The family is Canidae. And it's the family level of classification that's likely the best approximation for what the biblical kind is. So if you then ask the question, well, how many kinds, how many families did Noah have to bring on board the ark, living and extinct, you only come up with about less than 2,000. So the ark has plenty of room for these creatures. Then, of course, that raises the question, you got families on board the ark, let's see, but there's now 30 plus species, hundreds of breeds of dogs within the dog family. That means you have a whole bunch of breeds and species from that pair on board the ark in, just a few thousand years? That's impossible. That's more evolution than Darwin proposed. That's sometimes how they'll state their argument against the scripture. So what's the answer to that? the answer, one of the answers, stems from something Darwin himself said. So one of his arguments for evolution that's sort of been lost in the modern discussion comes from the opening chapters of his book on the origin of species. In 1859, he was trying to argue against an archaic, outdated, unbiblical view of the origin of species. The older view back then was that God created species, not kinds, which is not biblically justified. Yeah. So he was just trying to find a way to argue against species being fixed and unchanging. And one of the things the arguments he gave in 1859 was a comparison. He said, let's compare the amount of variety that we see in the wild compared to the variety that we see on farms, on ranches. So we can use a modern version of this. If you look at the horse, donkey, zebra family, there's 3 species of zebras in existence today, 1 species of wild horse, the Przewalski's horse, wild asses, 2 in Asia, 1 in Africa. Yeah. 7 species total. There's over 850 breeds of horses and donkeys in existence today. So Darwin said, and challenged his contemporary creationists who thought that God created species, he said, okay, let's think about this logically. Where do all the breeds come from? And so today we could say, where do the 700 plus breeds of horses come from? Yeah. Well, there's only one answer we can give, because we humans were responsible for producing them. We'll take, let's say, a long-haired black coat color horse and mate it with a short-haired red coat color horse to try to produce a long-haired red colored coat colored horse, that sort of thing. That's what we've been doing for however long, hundreds of years, millennia, to produce the breeds we want. The answer to Darwin's rhetorical question is, well, of course, all these 700 breeds come from a common ancestor, because we humans were the ones doing this. So then Darwin, once he's established that in the minds of his readers, okay, yeah, breeds have a common ancestor, he turns around and says, okay, why would you say species do not have common ancestors? So if the greater amount of variety, and if you look at the amount of variety that exists in breeds, it's stupendous. All that variety comes from a common ancestor. Why wouldn't you turn around and say this lesser amount of variety, zebras, horses, donkeys in the wild, why would you say those don't have a common ancestor? And that's a pretty good argument. It has its limits, because you can't really tie rhinos or tapirs into this equation. They're the closest living relatives, according to evolutionists, of the horses and such. All the amount of variety in horse breeds doesn't bridge the gap between horses and rhinos. It's a good argument, nonetheless, that really fits, I think, this idea of biblical kinds. So the question, though, is the question of time. How could you get 7 species of horses from a pair, or 7 species of horses, donkeys, zebras, from a pair of equids on board the ark in just a few thousand years? Yeah. And this is where we can take Darwin's argument to its logical conclusion. He didn't discuss the question of time. He just assumed millions of years in his arguments. And let's do it now then. Let's take it to its logical conclusion. So I'm going to make an argument within the evolutionary framework, use the evolutionists' own statements against them to show that we can very easily get breeds and species in just a few thousand years. So if you ask the evolutionists today about those 7 living equid species, 3 zebras, 3 asses, one horse, you say, well, how long did it take, evolutionarily speaking, for these species to arise? And the literature will tell you about 4 million years. 4 million years for 7 species. So, of course, they say that's ridiculous to say these 7 species happen in just a few thousand. And this is where I'd stop them and say, hold on. Tell me, evolutionists, tell me how long it took for the 700 breeds of horses to arise. So you think, for many, do the math, you say 7 species in the wild, 700 breeds, that's a 100-fold difference. 4 million years for the wilds, well, maybe it'd take 400 million years for the breeds. And that's not the answer you'll find in the literature. The evolutionists themselves say these 700 plus breeds arose not over 400 million years, but over just 12,000. So think of that. There's 700 breeds in just a few thousand years. 7 species in 4 million years. Those numbers don't make any sense. Using Darwin's own logic, you basically have to say, even within an evolutionary framework, if 700 breeds can arise in a few thousand years, then surely 7 species can. So from Darwin's own pen, we can make an argument showing the plausibility of species in a few thousand years. Of course, I don't accept the 12,000 year time scale. That was just to show that the evolutionists can't even make a consistent argument against the young Earth model. I'd say it goes down to a few thousand years, 4,500 or so. But looking at what's been done on the farm immediately makes all the more plausible what we've seen in the wild. So that's one of many arguments we could make showing that this is quite plausible. And actually, genetically, it goes back to this idea of big A, big B, little b. If animals, these kinds, were created genetically homogeneous, with no variety in their DNA, all capital letters or all lowercase letters, then yeah, it's pretty hard to create species, to make species in a few thousand years. However, if God creates these kinds with capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, and you do that for the millions of DNA positions that exist, you're going to exhaust all the letters of the English alphabet and more. That means they have the potential to produce all sorts of variety in a single generation. We now have multiple lines of evidence indicating that this was indeed the case. This is how God created the kinds in the beginning. Yeah. So they have the potential within themselves to form all sorts of species in sort of an evolutionary heartbeat. And the reason the evolutionists have not come to this conclusion is because they reject from the outset this idea that there could have been front-loaded genetic variety. They say, nope, everything must be the result of genetic mistakes. This precludes them from even considering the possibility that there were front-loaded genetic information, front-loaded genetic variety at the start. And so they've missed this incredible explanation for how so many species can arise in just a few thousand years. But we can see the echo of it in the breeds that have formed. Those are formed not by and large, not by farmers going in and mutating the DNA of horses. They're just taking what exists, the variety that already exists in their genetics, and just reshuffling it.
Today's guest, Dr. Kevin Anderson, received his PhD in microbiology and was a research fellow at the National Institutes of Health. He has served as a university professor, taught graduate-level molecular biology, directed the research of advanced degree students, and was the director of research for a biotech company. He has also written numerous technical publications and is currently the director of the Van Andel Creation Research Center in Arizona.
And then we have recognition, and this was in the publication Science a few years ago, rapid evolution. So they're acknowledging, changes can occur very quickly. I would argue as a creationist, one of the reasons changes occur very quickly is because the organisms are already pre-programmed for those changes. There's already a programming given by the creator that allows them to adapt and change quickly. So while it may be called rapid evolution, I would argue the better terminology is rapid adaptation.
And here we're not talking about birds turning into cows. We're just talking about birds
We're
changing
talking
the
about
kind of bird it might be.
A change of color, a change of maybe beak shape, a change of maybe skull shape.
And that can happen rapidly.
Yes. Let's look at this, for example. We have 3 different shapes of skulls. Now, if all we knew about these skulls was what we would find in the fossil record, so we just dug these 3 up, what would be the paleontological interpretation? How would they interpret that? Would they say these are 3 different species? Would they say that this represents an evolutionary lineage? I would say almost for certain that's what they would do. This is an evolutionary lineage. But it's not. It's the purebred bull terrier skull as it changed between 1931 and 1976.
So this is the skull of the same creature that man has developed with his breeding. And it's changed that much.
It's changed that much. And so if all you knew about this was what was in the fossil record, you would draw a completely wrong interpretation of the data. Doesn't that give us pause of how we should interpret the fossil data if we recognize living creatures today can undergo this kind of change in very short periods of time? We don't necessarily then have appropriate interpretation in the fossil record saying, well, this must have taken millions of years. And this doesn't even represent an evolutionary lineage. This creature is not evolving into this creature, evolving into this creature. That's not how it's working. It's not what's going on here.
It right away reminds me of all of those diagrams and pictures that we've seen of the, ape to human skull, which some of them aren't even as different from one to the next, and they're saying they're all these different hominids and so forth.
Particularly when you're trying to go with the pre-human skulls and trying to say these form a lineage up to modern human, it can very much fit these types of categories where you're really just looking at variations of primates. They're not moving evolutionary upward to becoming a human. It's just variation of different types of primates.
And here it's not even it's the same exact creature over 40 years.
Just selective artificial breeding has caused this much change, and we genetically understand why. Because in the DNA, we understand the certain repeated sequences, and I give an example, certain repeated sequences where you just, during the replication that occurs of the DNA, it now introduces a additional sequence of this. And then if it replicates again, it introduces another of this sequence. And when you introduce enough of them, you get dramatic morphological changes, such as the skulls we just showed. Another example would be repeated codons. You can have, for example, 18 to 20 codons for the amino acid glutamine. Or you could have it followed by 12 to 17 codons for the amino acid alanine. In other words, DNA sequences that repeat often create morphological changes. And so we can introduce a wide variety of morphological changes to animals, dogs and cats and cows and such, just simply by these repeated sequences. Now, there's still a dog, there's still a cat, there's still a cow, right? But we can introduce a lot of variety physically within these different organisms by these repeated sequences in the DNA. So we can get very dramatic changes physically just simply by these events. It doesn't explain how the cow became a cow. It doesn't explain how the dog became a dog. It just explains all the variety we see today.
Within that particular creature type.
Within that particular creature, correct. So the appearance of a new trait does not necessarily mean the appearance of new genes. We don't have to have a new genetic system in the organism in order to be able to get some of these traits. If I start out with dogs that have medium fur length and I breed them together, okay, what I could have then is I could have a combination of long fur and short fur. Nothing's changed genetically. It's just simply a matter of what trait is being expressed because of how I'm doing the breeding. So if we look at the standard evolutionary view of speciation.
Okay, now I know that fellow there.
That's Mr. Potato Head.
Mr. Potato Head.
Exactly. What the evolutionists would interpret is that you have a Mr. Potato Head that doesn't have a face. And they would say then the speciation would be, we're going to form 4 new species. One new species now has purple ears. One new species now doesn't have any ears, but he's got a face. Another species, but no mouth. Another species doesn't have any ears, but he's now got a face and a mouth. And another new species has eyes, but not a mouth, nose, or ears.
And all of that is brand new because none of it is from the ancestor.
Correct. This would be the classic way that evolutionists would view speciation, is each species introducing some new, not only new trait, but some new genetic system that didn't exist before. Now, if we look at what's really going on with speciation, we'd say we start out with everything there. And what we're going to do to make a new species is we're going to get rid of stuff. We're going to remove the face. Now we have just ears. We're going to remove the mouth. Now we got a face with no ears or mouth. So we're going to get rid of things. This is a new species, but see, it's going the opposite direction.
I was going to say it's upside down. They're starting off with less and getting more.
Correct.
But what we actually see, and this is what we see,
actually see,
you have more.
This,
and then you get to less.
Yes. Speciation is actually a reducing situation. You're getting rid of genetic events, genetic activity that was previously there. Now they'd point to, well, but he's got white ears. Well, but that's probably loss of pigment, loss of something already there. And they say, well, he's got blue eyes. This guy has black eyes. Again, that's probably the loss of pigment giving him blue eyes. So yeah, you can see some physical differences occur from this original guy, but they're again a result of we've lost stuff. We don't have what we used to have anymore.
And it's not what evolution is saying.
Evolutionists view speciation as a gaining process, that you're developing all this new genetic activity. So look at, all of a sudden all this that you didn't have before. And what we actually see in speciation is the opposite. You remove, you take away. It may be a new trait, but it's because of lack of something, the genetics for a pigment or the genetics for some type of physical feature are now gone.
I think that's huge. The theory says this is what we should see. Science and actual fact that we can see does not show that at all.
The appearance of a new trait does not in any way mean that it suddenly has new genetics, it suddenly has new genes. Now, the biblical view of speciation would in many ways be just the opposite. families that we identify today classification-wise are going to be approximately the biblical kind.
You need to realize that time is the critical factor here, and time is going to be a key factor when we're considering evolution.
Time is their god, as I've said. But time is the killer for evolutionary theory. Time doesn't make things better. Time leads to extinction and degeneration.